Stigmata itself is the display of extreme case of neuroplasticity of the brain, where identity with someone suffering to such degree, then one's own body begins to emulate that. See? So in other words, one's identity and the whole ethos of Christianity is identifying with Christ's suffering. It is through identifying with Christ's suffering that we can go through life through our own suffering, because Christ suffered.
So I was just thinking about this idea since weeks, because coming from this culture and knowing our history, it's like I have this idea that the real development has to be through a pain, which is, I don't know, just kind of idea, but I'm thinking if it's just the idea that was so much like ingrained or imprinted in subconscious, I was thinking maybe it's not really possible, like it's not really necessary to develop through pain, but through joy, for example, if I would change this idea, for example. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about that?
It's not an easy question, you know. I would say first, if you've asked me this question 20 years ago, I would have immediately said that yes, it's an erroneous idea. Life should proceed from joy, happiness. This should always be our motivational force and also toward the force of what we do. At the very same time, the day and age we live in is such that it is known for making suffering inevitable. And there are reasons for that. Why that is. Why suffering is inevitable. Well, it's the day and age when the field, right, of action, in Sanskrit is referred to as dharma. The field of action is said to be violated. What it means is that the field of action where, let's say, all the laws of nature expresses themselves at times or in times when the whole doesn't violate its parts, nor the parts violate the whole. Everything functions and acts in accord with each other. Everything, not just people, everything. There seems to be what we call harmony prevails. And prevailing of harmony here has this, like, let's say, how it is described, for instance, in some of the scriptures. Seasons come in due time, right? Everything, therefore, there is this way to plan the life in accord with that, because seasons are following each other. For example, if you look into these ancient accounts, that interestingly, that the stability in weather was much greater, in a sense of why have these certain points were marked distinctively. Summer solstice, winter solstice, equinoxes, right? Because they will mark a distinctive change of seasons, transitions. So in other words, cosmic cycles were definitively marked. We know for a fact that seasons are completely playing havocs. Weathers outside, like for instance, we did not have one day where temperature gone to zero in Mallorca this winter. So many bugs and flies, it's tropics, okay? At the same very time, like extreme expressions of weather, Somewhere gets very, very cold, unusually cold in terms of the fluctuations of temperature. In other areas. So I'm just giving this as an example first before we jump into the psyche or psychology of human behavior. Because then, of course, we can split hairs here. Well, humans seem to always be very special and unusual creatures, constantly fighting, constantly disputing, constantly dividing, right? There is, I mean, it's only true to the point of, let's say, immediately recorded history. We don't know how civilizations prior to ours lived. We don't know, but there are records in epics. Not a singular culture, not just in India. There are records of golden ages. Why this idea of a golden age exists in various cultures? Why these ideas of epochs, right, these yugas exist? There's something to that. We can develop this. I don't want to just give this a narrative of sequential kind of like linear unfoldment, because it is, of course, concentric. But for a moment. So it seems that suffering is a sign of our time which turns people towards the better part of themselves. This was my experience. My experience. I cannot tell for you. For me, it is through touching sufferings firsthand that was the bouncing point towards, let's say, going in the direction of evolution. You see? And I've observed that in a lot of other cases. Suffering can be different. It can be physical suffering. It can be emotional, psychological suffering. It can be all of that together. So at the very same time, I'm with you why there have to be this, why pain has to be the driving force, right? For instance, I remember very well back in the days when when I was still partaking in the darshans of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, when it would be televised, and there was this reminiscing of years when he first started teaching, when he first time, like let's say, was introduced in like still as a young man in India to the idea of what Christianity, of which we just spoke a moment ago about, the idea of the suffering God, that God has to take the suffering of humanity onto himself, which is very, very leitmotif, right, of Christianity. Certainly, it's the key aspect of Catholicism. No? I want to some notes simply so that I don't speak to a void, right? Your old folks come from this tradition. Your mothers and fathers and grandfathers certainly and grandmothers were steeped in that. The idea of redeeming the sin. The Christ here, why is he suffering on the cross? Why is Christ suffering on the cross? Because only through that, accordingly, theologically speaking even, he can redeem the sins of humankind. But before even that, he redeems the sin of the original fall. Christ, theologically speaking, redeems the fall of Adam and Eve. But more emphatically in the patriarchal system, it is the Adam who falls. Yes, of course, there are different connotations. Tempted by the serpent of the Eden, and then first serpent seduces the Eve, right? Because he whispers Eve this, let's say, pangs of curiosity, and with the curiosity also, why cannot we eat from the tree of the knowledge? Why cannot we partake in the fruits of knowledge, right? Why is it reserved only for whoever, not for us? And then Adam being simplistic, right? Basic as us men, we go with what is being suggested by our loved ones. And since there was not much choice in the paradise, right? Eve she ruled man, seriously. So Follow me, please. I like to go on a spin. Then it all will begin making sense. So theologically speaking, this is not just religious indoctrination. On Sunday you go to church, whether you are in Krakow or Rome or somewhere in Belfast, right, where Catholicism still rocks. There is this, it's not a sermon that is delivered there. I'm talking about Thomas Aquinas, Saint Augustine. I'm talking about, like illustrious figures of Christianity, right? We're talking about theologians. Meister Eckhart, mystics of Christianity. They all left work behind. And theologians give here these interpretations of what the Christ and crucifixion meant to represent. And one of the indisputable reasons why Christ has to go through that suffering is he has to redeem the fall of Adam. Adam falls. You see? In Adam we fall. In Christ we rise. This is the arc of Christianity. One day some of you will touch your religion so closely when you reach transcendence, you will be given a choice. Either to go beyond religion, simply go. Very difficult path. That's responding to a question, how do I worship Shiva? Right? That's the interaction I had with the lady who was sitting here on the first night. Right? She didn't ask it in that way. I gave example as someone asked at the online darshan. But the similarity there, very, very, very close. But in some of us, there would be this other possibility to get to the core of the tradition that we literally here genetically, epigenetically suckled with the milk of the mother. Even if that was more suckled by my grandmother, your grandmother, to a grandma. See? So in other words, then the true meaning of that religious revelation will be revealed to you. So these theological perspectives, they are not a waste of time. You will discover a healthy hunger, appetite, interest, craving to know. You see? Because these structures in you, these vasanas, you are aware of these terms? Sanskrit terms, vasanas? Yes or no? Comme ci, comme ça. Mniej więcej. Tak? Más o menos, mniej więcej. Tempting to speak Polish, but folks, will leave most of you behind, so. Okay. These psychic impressions, right? They can, and in the majority of cases, are impediments. And they begin to spin out of our system, that is true. But there is something to when this is connecting us to that linear family tree, that what we speak about, let's say, down to seventh generation, the whole concept of seventh generation here, funny enough, now taking hold very strongly in not quantum science, in neuroscience. In neuroscience, the longevity of the information passed by the DNA. In other words, how far we are wired to the information field passed on. And this has been extended over the past 100 years. You go and all of you, there you all read Lynn McTaggart classic, The Field, the book. Who has heard about this? Yes, good. Classic. Really, really put things into perspective. And that book was written ages ago. So this is where these suggestions were made, but since there was quantum leap in neurosciences, reconfirming a lot of stuff that was done When I first encountered this book, it was shocking to me to learn how advanced studies in neurophysiology were made before even Second World War. But the funds ran out everywhere. They ran out in Germany, they ran out in Russia, they ran out in Soviet Union, because this is where the most advanced studies were made in United States. Everything was towards the need of the military. So they were hijacked by effectively Frankenstein driven ethos rather than the true investigation into what is it means to be human truly. So anyways, this, let's say, Maharishi's comment was, what a cruel idea. What a cruel idea to make a suffering God, to make Jesus as an icon, as a symbol of suffering. So, like, because then every sincere believer would identify with the suffering of Christ. What is stigmata? Psychologists in this room? Practicing, trained psychologists? Aren't you psychologists, folks?
I am.
Yes, so why are you not responding? Psychologist? No? Who else is a psychologist? Every single immersion we have psychologists. Openly or undercover. Always. It doesn't matter. Always. Sometimes 2 or 3. Published, practicing with their own, as it were, practice. So, correct me if I'm wrong. In psychology, this, what we just spoke, what we are speaking about, is very well known. Stigmata, for it, phenomenon of stigmata. See, you know what stigmata is, right? Yeah. It's when suddenly people begin to display, right? The fervent believers begin to sometimes even bleed from places where Christ's body was purportedly nailed. And we know that it's impossible to nail through the wrist, anatomically impossible. It would have to be nailed between these bones, because here, under the weight of the body, it will immediately rip the flesh and the body will collapse under its own weight. These are very well-known studies, horrifyingly so confirmed, in Philippines, where young men undergo this actual act of crucifixion. You know that, right, folks? So what do? They wrap this so that they don't slide through. They use ropes to hold their wrists to the wooden part of the horizontal part of the cross, so that the body doesn't collapse under its own weight, being nailed through the palm of the hand, where the stigmata is performed. Roman crucifixions were always like that. Roman crucifix was a T-shape. T-shape. Who knows also? Yesterday I forgot about it. When we talked about it, before the cross, right? Before the emulation of Egyptian cross, which is that, the first Christian symbology was a T-shape. Because this was a Roman way of punishment. People were simply tied, the hands down there, and they would die from dehydration in that position there, with whatever terrible consequences. So, stigmata itself is the display of extreme case of neuroplasticity of the brain, where identity with someone suffering to such degree, then one's own body begins to emulate that. See? So in other words, one's identity and the whole ethos of Christianity is identifying with Christ's suffering. It is through identifying with Christ's suffering that we can go through life through our own suffering, because Christ suffered. I don't want to go further onto this, But I just want to put this all for you into perspective, for you to separate wheat from the chaff, how much of that is true, how much of that is made in terms of the purely as part and parcel of the method of manipulation at a psychic level. So for you to manipulate someone's psyche, there have to be something which will carry a very powerful sentiment. This is a powerful sentiment. There's no more powerful sentiment. So nailing the story in such way, when Christ is nailed, that's how the Council at Nicaea manages to, in one way, create the narrative which we're still trying to collectively overcome. What I'm speaking now is blasphemous. Hopefully there are no jihadists among the Christians, because if this video is published, some people will think my mouth should be shut forever, right? Because what I'm saying is a pure blasphemy, and it's just not just plainly wrong, it's criminal and should be punished. Do you understand why? Do you understand why that is? Because what I'm saying is that the whole course of history was set in such way so that people would suffer deliberately, because that would consider to be the road to salvation. But there's already suffering because this is the age of Kali Yuga, Iron Age. And that's why Maharishi, as a young man, he said, such cruelty. That was his response, to make God a suffering God. You see? So it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, like I'm saying, in my own case, it had to be. You see? It had to be. Why? Well, I'm sorry. I'm not a saint. I was doing a lot of wrong things. So I was casting my own destiny. There's no one to blame. No blame, no circumstances to blame. So I could now clearly see and acknowledge all suffering was self-inflicted, self-made. You see? But it turned me to the path of self-realization, self-inquiry, and self-revelation. So I'm grateful, right? Why wouldn't I? But if someone doesn't want to go that path, I would always say, no, you don't have to. Why to suffer? No. Joy can be a legitimate portal to the kingdom of heaven. Joy, pure joy. And it should be. Because it's our nature, it's our essence, bliss, ananda. So claim it, take it. Let ananda be that driving force.